In this section of pre-algebra, we're going to be writing and solving proportions. Talking about elephants, each day an elephant eats 5 pounds of food for every 100 pounds of its body weight. How much does a 9,300-pound elephant eat per day? We're going to be using proportions to solve a problem like this. Proportion is an equation that states that two ratios are equal. Yesterday's lesson, we learned that ratios are two things that you compare, two items that you compare, two quantities that you compare. So now we're going to be dealing with proportions. And a proportion is an equation that states that the two ratios are equal. Simply said, it's two fractions that are equivalent. So in our first example, 2/3 is equal to 8/12. Those are two equivalent ratios that form proportions. In algebra, we have A/B is equal to C/D, where B cannot equal 0 and D cannot equal 0. So you're going to be taught today in this lesson 3 ways to solve proportions. The first example talks about solving a proportion using equivalent ratios, also known as mental math. So in an equivalent ratio, you can determine what x is in each of these problems. So in A, 3/8 is going to be equal to 12/32. So x is equal to 12. Because when you multiply 4 times 8, the denominator, you get 32. 4 times 3 is 12. So x is 12. Again, in solving proportions using equivalent ratios, you're doing it mentally. So in B, x will equal 4. And in our final example, in C, x will equal 24. Now, in our second method of solving a proportion, we're going to be using algebra. Now, for the sake of teaching, these problems will be relatively simple, but I want you to understand the steps of solving them because they will not be simple as you progress along in this lesson. So in example 2, using algebra to solve this first example, we are going to multiply each side by 12. Again, I realize that you can simplify and do this with equivalent ratios. But for the sake of teaching, we're going to multiply each side by 12 using the algebra solution. So, in the first example, x will equal 3. In D, we will multiply each side by 25. Ten is equal to x. In E, multiply each side by 9. (42) times 1 is 42, the numerator. 6 times 1, the denominator is 6. X is equal to 7. In our final example, using algebra, multiply each side by 4. So in solving word problems, I'm going to teach you how to set up a proportion to make sure you set it up correctly to solve. Yesterday, you rode your bike 18 miles in 2.5 hours. Today, you plan to ride your bike for 3.5 hours. If you ride at the same rate as yesterday, how far will you ride? So one way to set up this proportion, you'll notice that I've got a chart here. We're trying to figure out how many miles we're going to ride today. So we're going to ride for 3.5 hours. So x is to 3.5. As yesterday's miles, 18 was to 2.5. So in solving these proportions, you can have several options. Equivalent ratio would not be the one that you would choose. So you could choose solving it using the which method class? Algebraic. So in each of these ratios, we're going to multiply each side by 3 5/10. Simplify each of these by 5. Now I have 18 times 7/10, and that's going to equal to 12 6/10 for the numerator. Then 5/10 times 1 is 5/10. Once you divide this out, you would get 25 2/10. So if you were to travel the same rate of speed as you did yesterday, today you would have clocked 25 2/10 miles. Now, notice that we had miles to hours on the first ratio, miles to hours on the second ratio. Now, if you wanted to set it up another way, you could do miles today from miles yesterday as hours today and hours yesterday. You would get the same answer depending upon which method that you would use, but you need to be organized, and the ratios need to be set up the same. So we're going to go back to our initial screen that when we opened up this lesson. We're going to write and solve a proportion. Using the information that we had about the elephants and their eating habits on the first screen, we're going to write and solve a proportion to determine how much food an elephant that weighs 9,300 pounds eats per day. So in our initial problem, we had 5 pounds of food to every 100 pounds for the elephant. So again, setting up proportions, our numerator will be the x, how many pounds of food he'll eat in a day, as to how much the elephant weighs. So in our example, we're not going to simplify 5 pounds of food to 100 pounds of an elephant. We're going to leave it because I can see that I can multiply the numerator and denominator by 93. And when I multiply 5 times 93, I get 465 pounds per day food is eaten for an elephant for 9,300 pounds. I'll let you try to do the next one on your own. Come back and check your answer. Again, in this instance, I did not simplify it because I could multiply the numerator and denominator by 125 to solve this proportion. So, with an elephant that weighs 12,500 pounds, he's going to eat about 625 pounds in a day. Okay, in our last example here, I've given you 3 problems, 3 practice problems. We're going to use the final step. We talked about equivalent ratios. We talked about solving using algebra. Now we're going to use cross products. So in using cross products, it is another method in order to solve proportions. So in this first one, we're going to take 3 5/10 and multiply it times c, which is going to be equal to 150 times 10 5/10. 3 5/10 c is going to be equal to 1,575. Divide each side by 3 5/10. By 3 5/10. C will equal 450. In order to save space, I'm going to now erase this one and do the next example. 7n is equal to 12 times 1 and 68 hundredths. Again, remember, when you're multiplying decimals, you do not have to line them up. You just put the decimal in the place of the total of the factors of decimals. And there are two factor places. In the factors, there's two decimal points, so that's where I would get 20 and 16 hundredths. Then 20 and 16 hundredths divided by 7. And you can do this, finish this on your own. On 3, again, I'm going to use the cross products. So I'm going to have 2 times 24. It's going to be equal to 5 times k plus 3. Simplifying it using the distributive property, 5k plus 15. Now, I kept my answer to be a mixed number, not in decimal form, because I did not have any decimals in the original problem. I'm going to clear a space off for the last problem. Recap of our lesson today. We have been writing and solving proportions. In writing them, we discussed about how to set them up, and in solving them, we discussed 3 different ways: equivalent ratios, using algebra, and also using cross products. Depending on the problem and depending upon what your directions are asking you to do as to how you would solve each and every one of them. Each and every one of the problems that you've been given.